In the autumn of 2015, a beloved and successful couple, Marcus and Chloe Washington, were murdered in their immaculate suburban home. The crime was a silent, professional enigma, a double homicide with no forced entry, no clear motive, and no forensic trail. The only witness was the one person who could not speak. Their 4-year-old son, Leo, who was found by police hiding in a closet, rendered catatonically silent by the trauma he had endured. With no leads, the investigation, led by a competent but overburdened detective, concluded that the killings were likely a professional hit, a tragic case of mistaken identity that had no logical solution. For 2 years, the case went cold, a painful, unsolved mystery that left a family and a community shattered. But the truth was not lost. It was simply being held in the mind of a traumatized child. For 2 years, Leo communicated the only way he could, through obsessive, repetitive drawings of a strange symbol, a broken sun. To the world, it was a heartbreaking metaphor for his shattered life. But it was not a metaphor. It was a memory. It was the one, singular clue that the police had missed. A piece of psychological evidence that, once interpreted by his psychologist aunt, would unravel a story of devastating betrayal and expose a killer who had been hiding in plain sight, cloaked in the guise of a loving, grieving friend. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. We're in this together. Now, let me tell you what really happened. The silence was the first thing that struck Detective Frank Miller. It was a profound, unnatural quiet, a heavy, sound-dampening blanket that seemed to press in on him the moment he stepped out of his unmarked sedan. The house itself, a beautiful, 2-story modern architectural design in one of Charlotte's most exclusive neighborhoods, was a fortress of that silence. There were no flashing lights yet, no screaming sirens, just the quiet, professional hum of a crime scene in its first, sterile hour. Miller was a good cop, a 20-year veteran of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, a man who had built a career on a foundation of patience and methodical procedure. But as he ducked under the yellow tape and walked up the slate pathway, he felt a familiar, cold knot tighten in his stomach. A double homicide in a neighborhood like this was a rare and ugly thing. The front door was ajar, a single, silent invitation into the horror within. The patrol officers who had responded to the initial wellness check stood grim-faced in the foyer. One of them, a young cop Miller knew, just shook his head, his face pale. "It's clean, Frank," he said, his voice a low whisper. "Too clean." Miller stepped inside. The house was a masterpiece of interior design, a place of clean lines, expensive art, and a sense of minimalist, orderly calm that was now profoundly, grotesquely ironic. Marcus and Chloe Washington, the victims, were in the living room. They were, by all accounts, a golden couple. He was a brilliant, sought-after architect with his own thriving firm. She was a celebrated interior designer. Together, they had been a force, a symbol of Black excellence and success in a city that was still grappling with its own complex history. They lay on a large, cream-colored rug, their bodies positioned in a way that suggested a sudden, shocking violence that had been over in an instant. There were no signs of a struggle. The expensive furniture was undisturbed. A half-empty glass of wine sat on the polished concrete coffee table. There was no forced entry on any of the doors or windows. There was no sign of a robbery. Chloe Washington's diamond earrings still glinted in her ears, and Marcus's wallet was still in his pocket. Miller's experienced eye scanned the scene, his mind a cold, analytical machine. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was not a crime of passion. This was an execution. Efficient, silent, and personal. The killer was someone they had known. Someone they had willingly let into their home. He was about to begin his methodical walkthrough when he heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound from upstairs. A whimper. Every cop in the room froze. They had cleared the house, they thought. Miller drew his weapon, his heart pounding against his ribs. He and 2 other officers moved up the floating staircase. their footsteps silent on the polished wood. They cleared the bedrooms, one by one. Nothing. The sound had stopped. Miller stood in the hallway, listening to the crushing silence. And then he heard it again, a tiny, terrified sound, coming from inside the master bedroom's walk-in closet. He pushed the closet door open slowly. It was dark inside, the air thick with the scent of cedar and expensive perfume. And there, huddled in the far corner, behind a row of Chloe's dresses, was a small child. A little boy, no more than 4 years old, his knees pulled up to his chest, his small hands covering his ears. It was their son, Leo. He was physically unharmed, but his eyes, wide and dark in the gloom, were staring at something 1,000 miles away. He was not crying. He was not making a sound. He was simply gone. He had retreated to a place deep inside himself where the monsters couldn't follow. Miller, a father himself, felt a wave of profound, gut-wrenching pity. He holstered his weapon and knelt, his old knees protesting. "Hey there, little man," he said, his voice a soft, gentle rumble. "It's okay. We're the police. We're here to help you." Leo didn't move. He didn't blink. He was a perfect, silent statue of trauma. Miller knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was looking at the only witness to a double murder. And he also knew, with that same certainty, that the witness was a prisoner in his own mind. The key to the entire case locked away in a place that no detective, no matter how patient, could ever hope to reach. The investigation into the murders of Marcus and Chloe Washington was, from its inception, an exercise in frustration. It was a case built on a void, a crime defined not by the evidence it presented, but by the evidence it stubbornly withheld. Detective Frank Miller and his team threw every available resource at the case, but every lead they pursued dissolved into a dead end. Every door they opened led to another empty room. The first 48 hours were a blur of methodical and ultimately fruitless procedure. The forensics team had swept the house with a fine-toothed comb and had come up with almost nothing. There were no foreign fingerprints, no stray hairs, no fibers that didn't belong to the victims. The killer had been as clean as a surgeon. The murder weapon, which the medical examiner determined to be a small caliber firearm, likely fitted with a suppressor, was missing. The bullet casings had been meticulously collected by the killer. The crime scene, which had seemed so clean to Miller's naked eye, was on a microscopic level practically sterile. The next phase of the investigation focused on the victims themselves. Miller's team began the painstaking work of deconstructing the lives of Marcus and Chloe Washington, looking for the one hidden crack, the one secret enemy that could explain their execution. They found nothing. They were, by every conceivable measure, a beloved and respected couple. They had no known enemies, no business disputes, no history of drugs or infidelity. They were generous donors to local charities. They were mentors to young black architects and designers. They were, it seemed, the last people on Earth who would be the targets of such a cold, professional killing. Miller personally handled the financial investigation, a deep dive into the couple's bank accounts, investments, and the books of Marcus's architectural firm. He was looking for the classic motives: debt, blackmail, a secret deal gone wrong. Again, he found nothing. The Washingtons were wealthy, but their finances were in perfect, transparent order. Marcus's firm, Washington Cross Architecture, was thriving, with a portfolio of high-profile projects and a spotless reputation. The business accounts were clean. The only witness, 4-year-old Leo, remained a silent enigma. He had been taken in by his aunt, Serena Washington, Marcus's younger sister. Serena, a child psychologist, was now his legal guardian. Miller had interviewed her several times. She was sharp, intelligent, and devastated, but she could offer no insight, no potential suspects, no hint of any trouble in her brother's life. Miller had made several attempts to speak with Leo himself in the presence of Serena and a child trauma specialist. The sessions were heartbreakingly unproductive. The moment the conversation would gently, carefully, be steered towards that night, Leo would shut down completely. He would retreat into that silent, distant place, his eyes going vacant, his small body rigid. He was not being defiant. He was psychologically incapable of accessing the memory. The trauma had built a wall around it, a fortress of silence that no one could breach. The doctors called it traumatic mutism. They said it could last for months, for years, or forever. As the weeks turned into months, the case went cold. The initial media frenzy faded, replaced by other, newer tragedies. The Washington murders became a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered in the city's wealthy enclaves. For Detective Miller, it became a weight. It was the case that haunted him, the one he would think about late at night, staring at the ceiling. He had done everything by the book. He had followed every procedure, but the case remained a perfect, seamless, and infuriating mystery. The killer had walked into that beautiful, silent house, had committed a perfect crime, and had walked out, leaving behind only ghosts and a silent boy who held the key to the entire case, locked away in his traumatized mind. After 6 months of dead ends, the official investigation into the Washington murders had ground to a halt. The case file, already thick with negative lab reports and fruitless interview transcripts, was moved from the active investigation board to the cold case archives. For Detective Frank Miller, it was a professional defeat that felt like a personal failure. But the department needed a conclusion, a narrative to explain the unexplainable, and in the absence of evidence, a theory was born. The theory was presented in a final, somber meeting between Miller, his captain, and the district attorney's office. It was a theory born of logic, deduction, and the complete absence of any other plausible explanation. It was a professional hit, Miller's captain stated, his tone one of grim finality. It's the only thing that makes sense. The theory, as he laid it out, was compelling in its cold, brutal logic. The crime scene itself was the primary evidence. The lack of forced entry suggested the killer was known to the victims. The efficiency of the murders, the use of a suppressed weapon, the collection of the casings, the lack of any forensic trail, all of it pointed to a level of skill and planning that was far beyond a common criminal or a crime of passion. So what's the motive? The assistant DA asked. We don't have one, Miller admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. And that's what makes it a professional job. The motive isn't tied to them personally. It's external. Marcus and Chloe weren't the targets because of who they were. They were the targets because of something they were involved in that we know nothing about. The theory then branched into a series of dark, speculative possibilities. Had Marcus, the architect, inadvertently become entangled with a dangerous client? Had he discovered that one of his construction projects was being used as a front for money laundering by the mob or a drug cartel? Had Chloe, the interior designer who worked in the homes of the city's wealthiest and most powerful people, overheard something she wasn't supposed to? This narrative explained everything. It explained the professionalism of the crime. It explained the lack of a clear, personal motive. And it explained why the investigation had hit a brick wall. A professional killer, hired from out of state, would have no connection to the victims, no place in their world. He would be a ghost, a phantom who had appeared for one night, performed his task, and then vanished back into the criminal underworld, leaving no trail to follow. The most tragic part of the theory was that it was, in a way, a case of mistaken identity. The Washingtons hadn't been killed for who they were, but for what they represented, or what they had accidentally stumbled upon. They were, in this narrative, almost random victims, their perfect lives tragically intersecting with a dark, hidden world they never knew existed. The professional hit theory became the official, if unspoken, conclusion of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. It was a story that provided a kind of closure, a way to categorize an otherwise baffling crime. It allowed the department to close the active case without admitting complete failure. It was an acknowledgement that some crimes, particularly those committed by skilled, professional killers, are simply unsolvable. For the public, and even for the grieving families of the victims, the theory offered a strange, cold comfort. It was a horrifying story, but it was a story that made a kind of sense. It was easier to believe that Marcus and Chloe had been the victims of a powerful, shadowy criminal organization than to believe that their deaths were a random, meaningless act of violence. The case file was stamped inactive, pending further leads. The ghost story now had a ghost for a killer. And the one person who knew the truth, the small, silent boy at the heart of the mystery, remained locked in his own private world. His silence, the final, perfect seal on a crime that everyone had now accepted as unsolvable. 2 years. For Serena Washington, the 2 years since her brother and sister-in-law had been murdered were a landscape of dual realities. By day, she was Dr. Washington, a respected child psychologist, a woman who moved through a world of clinical observation, of play therapy, of the carefully chosen, gentle words used to help children navigate the complex, often frightening terrain of their own emotions. Her professional life was one of control, of empathy, guided by science. But by night, she was just Serena, the grieving sister, the reluctant guardian, a woman adrift in a sea of loss so profound it often felt like it had no bottom. She lived in the same beautiful, silent house where her brother's family had been so happy. A house that was now a museum of a lost life, its every corner holding a ghost. Her life was a difficult, exhausting balance, a constant toggling between the professional who understood trauma and the woman who was drowning in it. At the center of her world was Leo. Now 6 years old, he was a quiet, watchful boy, a ghost in his own childhood. The catatonic silence of the first few months had given way to a fragile, hesitant speech. He could talk about school, about dinosaurs, about the color of the sky. But about that night, there was still only a profound and absolute silence. The wall his mind had built around the trauma remained impenetrable. Any attempt to approach it, however gently, would send him retreating back into that silent, vacant place. Serena, with her professional training, understood the mechanism. It was a form of psychological self-preservation, a dissociative amnesia that was protecting his young, fragile psyche from a memory too monstrous to bear. She knew that pushing him would only do more damage. The memory, if it was ever to surface, had to do so on its own terms, in its own time. But the silence was a constant, maddening presence in the house. It was the empty space at the dinner table. It was the unanswered question that hung in the air of every room. Serena was haunted by the official police theory of a professional hit. It felt wrong. An impersonal, generic explanation for a crime that had been so deeply personal. Her brother had not lived in a world of mobsters and cartels. He had lived in a world of blueprints, of family dinners, of bedtime stories. The theory was a fiction, a story the police had told themselves because the truth was a blank page. Her frustration with the stalled investigation was a low, constant hum of anger beneath her grief. She had regular, if unproductive, check-ins with Detective Miller. He was a good man, she knew, and he was as haunted by the case as she was. But he was a man who dealt in physical evidence, and there was none. He would listen patiently as she described Leo's progress, his nightmares, his struggles. But to him, it was the sad clinical data of a traumatized child, not the key to an unsolved homicide. Her life was now a closed loop, a small, quiet world defined by her work, her grief, and her all-consuming protective love for her nephew. She had friends, but they couldn't understand the strange, dual reality she inhabited. They saw a strong, resilient woman who had stepped up to save her family. They didn't see the woman who would sit in Leo's room late at night, watching him sleep, and feel a wave of such profound, helpless sorrow that it felt like she was physically breaking apart. She was the sole guardian of this small, broken boy, and the sole keeper of a hope that everyone else had abandoned. The belief that the answer to who had destroyed their family was locked somewhere inside him, waiting for the right key. Leo's world was one of symbols. Since the trauma had stolen his ability to narrate his own past, he had found another language, a visual language of obsessive, repetitive art. His primary, and only, subject was a strange, recurring symbol that Serena and his therapists had come to call the broken sun. It appeared everywhere. He would fill entire sketchbooks with it. page after page of the same stark image. It was a perfect circle, drawn with the focused intensity of a child monk, and then a single, sharp, jagged line, like a bolt of lightning, would be slashed through its center. He would draw it with crayons, with markers, with finger paint. He would trace it in the condensation on a window pane, in the sand at the playground, in the spilled sugar on the kitchen counter. It was his mantra, his icon, his one constant and indecipherable message from the silent country of his trauma. Serena, in her dual role as aunt and psychologist, had spent 2 years trying to decode it. The professional interpretation was textbook. The sun, a universal symbol of warmth, of life, of the father figure, had been violently broken. The circle represented his once whole, safe world. The jagged line was the trauma, the act of violence that had shattered it. It was a heartbreakingly clear visual metaphor for the murder of his parents and the destruction of his family. His therapists all agreed. The drawing was a classic, powerful expression of a child's grief and terror. It was a window into his emotional state, but to Serena, who knew the intricate, often literal workings of a child's mind, the interpretation, while logical, had always felt incomplete. There was a precision to the drawing, a consistency that felt less like an emotional expression and more like an act of documentation. He would draw it the same way every single time. The circle was always a perfect circle. The jagged line was not just a random slash, it was a specific shape, with the same number of sharp, angular turns. It was as if he was not just drawing a feeling, but reproducing an image he had seen, an image that had been burned into his eidetic child's memory. She would watch him for hours as he drew, his small face a mask of intense concentration. He would sometimes add other elements. He would draw the broken sun on the side of a toy truck. He would surround it with other, more chaotic scribbles. But the central image was always the same, a constant, unchanging symbol at the heart of his visual world. His nightmares were another window. He would wake up screaming, not with words, but with a single guttural cry of pure terror. When Serena would rush to his side, he would be drenched in sweat, his small body rigid, his eyes wide with a horror he could not name. And in the morning, the first thing he would do, before breakfast, before getting dressed, was find a piece of paper and draw the broken sun, as if to exorcise the demon of the night before. The drawing was a source of deep academic fascination for his therapists. They wrote papers on it, presented it at conferences as a case study in childhood trauma. It was a perfect, tragic symbol. But for Serena, living with the constant, silent repetition of the image, it began to feel less like a symbol and more like a clue. It was a message in a bottle, sent from the shipwreck of his memory, and she was the only one who was there to receive it. But she did not have the key to translate it. The drawing was a constant, heartbreaking reminder of the truth she could not reach, a truth that her nephew was screaming onto the page in a language that no one, not even she, could understand. In the quiet, fractured world that Serena and Leo now inhabited, Gideon Cross was a constant and seemingly indispensable source of light and stability. He was, to all outward appearances, a man shattered by the loss of his best friend and business partner, who had channeled his grief into a fierce, protective devotion to the family that was left behind. He was Uncle G, the man who showed up every Sunday with pizza, who took Leo to the park, who could sometimes, for a few precious moments, coax a genuine, unburdened laugh from the quiet, watchful boy. Gideon had handled everything in the nightmarish aftermath of the murders. He had dealt with the police, the media, the funeral arrangements. He had been the strong, stoic rock that Serena, in the first, disorienting weeks of her own grief, had leaned on. He had helped her navigate the complex legal and financial labyrinth of her brother's estate, setting up a trust fund for Leo, ensuring that Marcus's hard-earned success would be protected for his son. Serena, overwhelmed and grieving, had been profoundly, almost desperately grateful. He remained a fixture in their lives. He would call Serena every few days to check in, his voice a warm, comforting baritone on the other end of the line. "How's my little man doing?" he would always ask. Is he talking anymore? Is he drawing? He would listen with a deep, sympathetic focus as Serena would describe Leo's latest struggles, his small victories, his obsessive, heartbreaking drawings of the broken sun. Poor kid, Gideon would say, his voice thick with a sadness that felt completely genuine. He's just trying to make sense of a world that doesn't make sense. You're a saint, Serena. I don't know how you do it. His devotion to Leo was absolute. He would bring him expensive, thoughtful gifts. A large, detailed model of a Tyrannosaurus Rex, a remote-controlled truck, a new set of professional-grade art supplies. He would sit on the floor with the boy for hours, helping him build elaborate Lego structures, his large, gentle hands a stark contrast to the small, delicate ones of the child. Leo, who was wary and withdrawn around most adults, seemed to have a quiet, trusting bond with his Uncle G. But as the months turned into years, Serena, with her psychologist's trained eye for the subtle, dissonant notes in human behavior, began to notice things. They were small things, almost imperceptible, but they began to accumulate in her mind like a series of troubling data points. Gideon's attention on Leo, she began to realize, was not just loving. It was intensely, almost unnervingly, watchful. When he was with the boy, his focus was absolute. He would watch Leo's every move, his every expression, with a kind of laser-like intensity that felt less like doting and more like surveillance. His questions about Leo's therapy, about his drawings, were not just the concerned inquiries of a friend. They were probing, specific, as if he were searching for a particular piece of information. She noticed that he would always steer the conversation away from the past, from any mention of Marcus or Chloe. If Serena brought them up, he would grow quiet, his expression shuttered, and would quickly change the subject back to Leo. It was a behavior she recognized from her clinical work: avoidance. The most unsettling incident was a small one. Leo had a collection of his father's old architectural models, which he treasured. One day, while Gideon was visiting, Leo had accidentally knocked one of the models off a shelf. It was a model of a large, commercial building, and it shattered on the hardwood floor. Leo, who rarely showed strong emotion, had let out a cry of pure anguish. Gideon had rushed to his side, but his reaction had been strange. Instead of comforting the boy, he had seemed almost panicked, his eyes darting around the room as if he were expecting a blow. "It's okay, Leo. It's okay," he had said, his voice a high, tight wire. "We can fix it. It's just a building. It's not real." The intensity of his reaction was wildly out of proportion to the event. Serena had filed the incident away, another troubling data point in a growing file. She told herself she was being paranoid, that her own grief was making her see suspicion where there was only love. Gideon was their rock. He was the one good, stable thing that had survived the wreckage of their lives. To doubt him felt like a betrayal, but the psychologist in her, the part of her that was trained to see the cracks in a carefully constructed facade, could not shake the feeling that the man who was so determined to help them heal was also the man who was most terrified of what that healing might reveal. The moment of revelation, when it came, was not a dramatic, thunderous breakthrough. It was a quiet, sickening click of a puzzle piece falling into place, a moment of profound, world-altering clarity that occurred in the most mundane of settings. A traffic jam on I-77. Serena was driving home from her office, her mind a tired soup of patient notes and the ever-present, low-grade hum of her own grief. The traffic had slowed to a crawl, and she found herself staring absently at the back of the vehicle in front of her. It was a white work van, a bit battered, with the name and logo of a local plumbing company on its rear doors. She watched it for a few minutes, her mind idle, and then the traffic began to move again. The van signaled and moved into the next lane, and the vehicle that had been in front of it was revealed. It was another white work van, but this one sent a jolt through her, a shock of recognition so profound it was like a physical blow. On the side of this van, in a clean, minimalist font, were the words Washington Cross Architecture. And next to the words was the company logo, a logo she had seen 1,000 times, a logo her own brother had designed. It was a stylized architectural rendering of a sun, a perfect circle, with a sharp, jagged, lightning bolt-like line running through its center, a design meant to represent the fusion of classical form and modern dynamic energy. Serena stared at it, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her heart beginning to pound against her ribs. A circle, a jagged line. The image on the van was not just similar to Leo's drawing. It was identical. The number of zigs and zags in the lightning bolt, the precise point at which it entered and exited the circle. It was a perfect, one-to-one match. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over her. The blaring horns of the traffic around her faded into a distant, meaningless roar. In that single, nauseating instant, 2 years of carefully constructed psychological theory crumbled to dust. The broken sun was not a metaphor. It was not a symbol of a shattered family. It was a literal, eidetic memory. Her 6-year-old nephew, the boy who could not speak of the trauma, had been drawing the one, central, and completely overlooked clue to the entire case. He had been drawing a corporate logo. She felt a cold dread seep into her bones, a dread that was different from her grief, sharper and more terrifying. If Leo was drawing the logo, he was not trying to communicate his feelings about the murder. He was trying to communicate a fact about the murder. He was trying to tell them that the crime, the unspeakable act of violence that had destroyed their family, was somehow, inextricably, linked to his father's business. The traffic began to move again, but Serena sat frozen in her lane, oblivious to the angry honks behind her. Her mind was racing, recontextualizing every drawing, every nightmare, every strange, symbolic act of Leo's play through this new, terrifying lens. The professional hit theory, the story of a random, external act of violence, evaporated in the face of this new evidence. The enemy had not come from the outside. The call was coming from inside the house. The killer was not a stranger. The killer was someone from her brother's professional world, someone from inside Washington Cross architecture. She finally managed to pull her car over to the shoulder of the highway, her body trembling. She thought of Leo, of his small, serious face bent over his drawings, his hand moving with such focused, repetitive intensity. He had not been lost in a world of traumatic symbols. He had been a witness, giving his testimony, over and over again, in the only language he had left. And for 2 years, no one, not even her, had been able to understand it. She felt a wave of profound, soul-crushing guilt, followed by a surge of cold, hard, and unfamiliar anger. The investigation was not over. It was just beginning. Armed with the terrifying new knowledge that Leo's drawing was a logo, Serena returned home that evening a different woman. The soft therapeutic lens through which she had viewed her nephew's trauma was gone, replaced by the sharp, analytical focus of a detective. Her home was no longer just a place of healing. It was an active crime scene, and her 6-year-old nephew was the star witness, communicating through a complex, symbolic code that she was now desperate to crack. She began to observe Leo's play not as a psychologist, but as a cryptographer. She sat on the floor of his playroom, a silent, watchful presence, and simply watched. For the first hour, his play was a familiar, comforting landscape of childhood. He built a tower of blocks. He ran his toy dinosaurs through a prehistoric jungle of houseplants. But then, as if drawn by an internal clock, he turned to a strange, repetitive ritual she had seen 100 times before, but had never truly understood. The ritual involved 2 specific toys. The first was a small, die-cast model of a construction dump truck. It was a toy that Gideon Cross had given him. Serena now saw, with a fresh jolt of horror, that Leo had taken a black marker and had meticulously drawn the broken sun logo on the truck's door. The second toy was a large ceramic piggy bank, painted to look like a smiling cartoon pig where he kept his allowance. Leo took the truck with his father's company logo on it, and began to make a low, rumbling sound in his throat. He drove it slowly, deliberately, across the floor. He then picked up the piggy bank, his small hands struggling with its weight, and placed it in the center of the room. And then, the ritual began. He took the truck and, with a sudden, shocking violence, began to smash it into the side of the piggy bank. Crash. 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 He was silent, his face a mask of intense, focused concentration, his small arm a piston of methodical destruction. He continued the assault until the ceramic piggy bank, weakened by the repeated blows, shattered on the hardwood floor, the coins inside scattering like shrapnel. Serena sat frozen, her psychologist's mind and her detective's intuition fusing in a moment of brilliant, horrifying synthesis. She had always seen this act as a simple, chaotic expression of rage, a traumatized boy lashing out at a symbol of his happy, broken home. But now, with the new context of the logo, she saw it for what it was. It was not a random act, it was a story. It was a symbolic reenactment. The truck, with the broken sun logo, represented his father's company, Washington Cross Architecture. The piggy bank, the universal childhood symbol of money, of savings, of wealth, represented their family's finances. He was not just smashing a toy. He was telling her, in the only way he could, what he had seen or heard. He was communicating a specific narrative idea. The company was involved in a violent act against their money. The professional hit theory, already weakened, now seemed utterly preposterous. This was not about a mistaken identity or a cartel. This was about the business. It was about the firm's finances. The motive for the murders, Leo was telling her, was money. A new, more terrible suspicion began to form in her mind. A suspicion that had been lurking in the deep, dark corners of her subconscious for months. The company was a partnership. Washington Cross, Marcus and Gideon, her brother, the creative genius, the architect, and Gideon, the man who handled the business, the man who controlled the money, the man who had given Leo the very truck he was now using to reenact a financial crime. The pieces began to click into place with a sickening, inexorable logic. Gideon's intense, watchful presence, his probing questions about Leo's progress, his panic when the architectural model had been broken. It was not the behavior of a grieving friend. It was the behavior of a guilty man, terrified that the one, silent witness to his crime might one day find the words or the symbols to expose him. Serena looked at her nephew, who was now sitting quietly amidst the wreckage of the piggy bank, the coins scattered around him like fallen leaves. He had done his part. He had given her the motive. He had told her the story. Now, it was her turn to act. The meeting took place in the same sterile, impersonal conference room at the CMPD headquarters where Serena had been told, 2 years prior, that her brother's case was being moved to the cold case files. This time, she was not there as a grieving family member. She was there as an expert witness, armed with a theory that was both psychologically complex and, she knew, forensically fragile. Detective Frank Miller sat across from her. His large frame slumped slightly in his chair, a look of weary patience on his face. He was a good man, and Serena knew he was still haunted by the Washington case. He had always treated her with a gentle, paternal respect. But as she began to lay out her new theory, she could see the skepticism hardening in his eyes. "Detective," she began, her voice calm and measured, the voice of a psychologist presenting a case study. "I believe Leo has been trying to tell us who killed his parents for the past 2 years. We just haven't been speaking his language." She laid out a series of Leo's drawings on the polished table between them, page after page of the same, obsessive, broken sun. Then, she placed a photograph of the Washington Cross architecture work van next to them. "This is not a metaphor for his grief, detective," she said, pointing from the drawings to the logo. "This is a memory." He is drawing the company logo. Miller leaned forward, his brow furrowed. He looked at the drawings, then at the photo. He could see the undeniable similarity. "Okay," he said slowly, his voice cautious. "I'll give you that. It's a match. But what does it mean? That he remembers his dad's work truck? It means the crime is connected to the business," Serena countered, her intensity rising. She then described the ritual with the dump truck and the piggy bank, carefully explaining the symbolic language of a traumatized child's play. "He's telling us the motive was money." He is showing us that the company was used as a weapon against his family's finances. Miller leaned back, a deep sigh escaping his lips. He ran a hand over his tired face. "Serena, Dr. Washington," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I want to believe you. God knows, I want to solve this case more than any other. But what you're giving me, it's a child's drawings. It's a broken piggy bank. I can't take that to a judge. I can't get a warrant based on a psychological interpretation of a 6-year-old's playtime. It's not evidence. It's a theory." "It's more than a theory," Serena insisted, her voice sharp with a frustration that had been building for 2 years. "It's testimony. It's the only testimony we have. You are a detective. You look for patterns. I am a psychologist. I do the same. And I am telling you, the pattern of Leo's behavior is not random. It is a consistent, repeated, and specific communication. He is pointing you in a direction, away from the professional hit theory and towards the one place no one has ever seriously looked, the company's finances, and the one person who controlled them." She let the implication hang in the air. Gideon Cross, the beloved Uncle G, the grieving best friend. Miller was silent for a long time, his gaze distant. He was a man of the physical world, of fingerprints and ballistics. This was a world of symbols and subconscious communication that he did not understand. It was flimsy, it was unorthodox, it would probably get him laughed out of the DA's office. But he was also a man haunted by the image of a small, silent boy in a closet. He had failed that boy 2 years ago. He had failed to find the monster that had destroyed his world. And now, the boy's aunt, a credible, intelligent professional, was telling him that the boy had been pointing the way all along. He looked at Serena, at the fierce, unwavering certainty in her eyes. It was a long shot. It was probably nothing, but it was the only shot they had. "Okay, Serena," he said finally, a decision made. "Okay, let's say I believe you. Where do we start?" Detective Miller's decision to pursue Serena's theory was a quiet, momentous shift in the investigation. It was a move away from the established, logical, but fruitless path of a conventional homicide case and into a strange, new territory of psychological forensics. The case was no longer about a mysterious external killer. It was now an internal inquiry, focused on the one person who had been closest to the victims. The new theory of the crime was a story of profound and devastating betrayal. The central suspect was no longer a phantom hitman, but Gideon Cross. The motive was no longer a mystery. It was the oldest and most common of them all: greed. Miller began to re-examine the entire case file through this new, terrifying lens. Every piece of the old investigation was now recontextualized. Gideon's constant supportive presence in the aftermath of the murders no longer looked like the actions of a grieving friend. It looked like the careful, controlling behavior of a killer managing a crime scene. His intimate knowledge of the family's routine, his own key to their house, explained the lack of forced entry. His close relationship with the victims explained why they would have let him in, why there were no signs of a struggle. He had not been an intruder. He had been an invited guest. The theory was that Marcus Washington, the meticulous architect, had finally, after years of trusting his partner implicitly, discovered the financial rot at the heart of their firm. He had found evidence of Gideon's long-running embezzlement. The murders were not a random act. They were a desperate, brutal act of silencing. Gideon had killed his best friend and his wife to prevent his own financial ruin and inevitable imprisonment. The one part of the theory that remained a mystery was Leo. Why had the killer spared the child? Miller, after a long conversation with Serena, came to a plausible, if chilling, conclusion. Gideon was not a professional killer. He was a white-collar criminal who had been pushed to violence. Killing his partner and his wife was a calculated act. But killing a small child, his own godson, the boy who called him Uncle G, was a line he could not cross. In a single, fleeting moment of hesitation, of some small residual piece of his own humanity, He had let the boy live, hiding him in the closet and hoping that the trauma would be enough to silence him forever. It was a gamble that, for 2 years, had paid off. Miller now had a coherent, compelling theory that explained every aspect of the crime. It explained the clean entry, the lack of a struggle, the missing murder weapon, and the absence of a traditional motive. But it was still just a theory, a story built on the interpretation of a child's drawings. He knew he could not get a warrant for Gideon's home or his personal records based on that. He needed a bridge, a way to connect the psychological evidence to the world of hard, prosecutable facts. The bridge, he decided, was the business itself. The one place where Gideon's secret life and Marcus's public life had intersected. The one place where the evidence of the motive must be hiding. He sat down with Serena and explained his strategy. "I can't get a warrant for Gideon personally," he said. "Not yet. But the business, Washington Cross Architecture, that's different. It was co-owned by a murder victim. The firm's assets are now part of his son's estate. You, as Leo's legal guardian, can petition the court to unseal the financial records for an independent audit as part of managing that estate. It's a civil matter, not a criminal one." "It's a back door," Serena understood immediately. It was a brilliant legal maneuver. It would allow them to get inside the one place Gideon thought was safe. The numbers. She would file the petition. They would get the audit. And if her theory, if Leo's story, was true, the truth would not be found in a bloodstain or a fingerprint. It would be found in a ledger. The legal petition, filed by Serena Washington as the executor of her brother's estate, was a masterpiece of dry, bureaucratic language. It requested a full, independent forensic audit of the now-defunct Washington Cross architectural firm, citing the need to establish a clear and final valuation of the assets for the trust fund of the surviving minor child, Leo Washington. There was no mention of a murder investigation, no hint of suspicion. It was a standard, if complex, probate court matter. Gideon Cross, when he was notified of the audit, had no legal grounds to object. He even, in a move of stunning arrogance, offered his full cooperation, expressing his hope that the audit would finally bring some financial clarity for dear Leo's future. To the outside world, he was the helpful, transparent business partner. To Detective Miller and Serena, he was a suspect, unwittingly opening the door to his own tomb. Miller knew he couldn't use a standard accountant. He needed a specialist, a bloodhound who could sniff out the faintest scent of fraud. He brought in a forensic accountant from the FBI's Charlotte field office, a woman named Maria Flores, who was legendary for her ability to make numbers talk. The audit was the second, and most critical, search of the investigation. The first search of the physical crime scene had yielded nothing. This search of the digital and paper crime scene was where Miller was placing his entire bet. Flores set up a temporary office in a secure room at the CMPD headquarters, and for 2 weeks, she disappeared into a world of invoices, bank statements, tax returns, and digital transaction logs from the Washington Cross servers. The first week was a study in frustration. On the surface, the firm's books were immaculate. Gideon Cross was a meticulous bookkeeper. Every penny was accounted for, every transaction logged. The firm appeared to be a model of financial health and probity. Miller began to feel a familiar cold sense of despair. Had Serena been wrong? Had he chased a ghost down a rabbit hole of psychological speculation? But on the 8th day of the audit, Flores called him into her office. She had a single spreadsheet projected onto a large monitor. "Here it is, Detective," she said, her voice calm but with an undercurrent of triumph. "It's beautiful." In a sociopathic kind of way, she showed him the system. It was a sophisticated embezzlement scheme, a ghost in the machine of the firm's accounting. Gideon had created a series of shell corporations, phantom subcontractors and suppliers, with names that were almost identical to their real, legitimate vendors. He would generate fraudulent invoices from these ghost companies for services that were never rendered, structural engineering reports that were never written, high-end materials that were never ordered. He would then pay these invoices from the firm's operating account, routing the money through a series of offshore accounts before it eventually landed in his own personal, hidden bank accounts. The fraud was massive, totaling over $2 million over a period of 4 years. It was a slow, systematic gutting of the company he had helped to build. Flores's analysis showed that in the months leading up to the murders, the embezzlement had become more frantic, more reckless. The company, which had appeared so successful on the surface, had been hollowed out from the inside. It was on the verge of a catastrophic financial collapse. He was running out of time, Flores concluded, pointing to a final series of transactions. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul, taking out secret, high-interest loans to cover the cash shortfalls he himself had created. The whole house of cards was about to come down. Miller stared at the spreadsheet, at the cold, hard, undeniable numbers that told a story of profound greed and betrayal. This was the motive. This was the secret that was worth killing for. But he still needed the trigger. What had happened on that specific day that had pushed Gideon from a white-collar criminal into a double murderer? The answer, Flores told him, was likely not in the numbers she had. It was in the numbers she didn't have. It was in the private records of the one man who had been about to uncover it all. Marcus Washington. The forensic accountant's report was the irrefutable proof of motive, the engine of the crime. But Detective Frank Miller knew that to secure a conviction against a man as careful and calculating as Gideon Cross, he needed to find the trigger. He needed to prove not just that Marcus Washington would have discovered the fraud, but that he was about to. The key, Miller was certain, lay in Marcus's own meticulous nature. He was an architect, a man who lived by the precision of blueprints and measurements. It was inconceivable that he would not have applied the same rigor to his own business. The official books were a fiction crafted by Gideon. Marcus must have kept his own records, a private ledger to track the real-world costs and profits of his projects. The search for this ledger became the final desperate phase of the investigation. Miller and his team went back to the original evidence logs from the crime scene. They re-examined every item that had been collected from the house. In a box of items from Marcus's home office, they found it. It wasn't a physical book, but a small, unassuming USB flash drive that had been overlooked in the original investigation, dismissed as a simple data backup. The drive was handed over to the department's digital forensics unit. It was unencrypted. When they opened it, they found a single, massive, and incredibly detailed spreadsheet. It was Marcus Washington's private financial Bible. He had tracked every project, every invoice, every hour of labor, and had cross-referenced it with his own cost projections. And there, in the final entries, dated the week of his murder, was the smoking gun. Marcus had created a new tab on the spreadsheet, labeled Discrepancies. He had begun to notice that the numbers from Gideon's official reports were not matching the reality of his project costs. He had highlighted a series of massive invoices from a subcontractor for geotechnical surveys, one of Gideon's shell corporations. Marcus had written a simple, damning note in the adjacent cell. No survey work was commissioned for the Henderson project. Need to verify this invoice. Where is this money going? But the final, heart-stopping piece of evidence was not on the spreadsheet. It was in the email archive that was also saved on the drive. The digital forensics team recovered a saved draft of an email from Marcus's personal account. It was addressed to the firm's external accountant. The email was short, professional, and to the point. "John," it read, "I'm seeing some significant discrepancies in the Q3 numbers that Gideon prepared. I'd like to schedule a full, independent review of the books with you as soon as possible. I've scheduled a preliminary meeting in my calendar for us to discuss this. Let me know if Friday morning works for you." The email was dated the morning of the day he was murdered. He had never had the chance to hit send. Miller stared at the screen, a cold, grim satisfaction settling over him. This was the trigger. Gideon, who as the business manager had access to Marcus's company calendar, would have seen the scheduled meeting. He would have known that his entire, elaborate fraud was just hours away from being exposed. The meeting with the accountant was his death sentence. He had been backed into a corner, and he had come out shooting. The digital evidence was the final, irrefutable nail in Gideon Cross's coffin. It was Marcus Washington's own voice, his own meticulous work, reaching out from beyond the grave to identify his killer. The numbers, which Gideon had so skillfully manipulated to hide his crimes, were now the very things that would condemn him. The truth had been there all along, saved on a tiny piece of plastic and silicon, a silent, digital witness waiting for someone to finally open the file. The confrontation was a quiet, almost anticlimactic affair. There was no dramatic confession under the heat of a bare light bulb. There was only the cold, quiet presentation of facts. Detective Frank Miller sat across from Gideon Cross in a sterile interview room at the CMPD headquarters. Gideon, who had come in voluntarily at Miller's request, still wore the mask of the concerned, helpful friend, though his eyes held a new, wary tension. Miller did not begin with an accusation. He began with a stack of paper. He laid the first document on the metal table between them. It was a single page from the forensic accountant's report, a flowchart that detailed the movement of money from the Washington Cross firm through a series of shell corporations and into a hidden bank account in the Cayman Islands, an account registered in Gideon's name. Gideon stared at the paper, his face impassive, but a single bead of sweat traced a path down his temple. Miller laid down the second document. It was a printout of the spreadsheet from Marcus's flash drive, with the highlighted cell and the note, "Where is this money going?" circled in red. Finally, Miller laid down the third and final document. It was the printout of the email Marcus had written to the accountant, the email he had never sent, scheduling the meeting that would have exposed everything. "The meeting was for Friday morning, Gideon," Miller said, his voice a low, even monotone. "You killed him on Thursday night. You ran out of time." Gideon Cross looked at the three pieces of paper, a perfect, logical, and irrefutable narrative of his crime. The mask did not just crack, it disintegrated. The charming, grieving Uncle G vanished, replaced by the cold, cornered embezzler beneath. He didn't speak. He simply sagged in his chair, a man whose carefully constructed world had just been dismantled by the ghosts of his own numbers. He invoked his right to an attorney. He would never speak of the crime again, but he didn't have to. The numbers had already told the whole story. The arrest and trial of Gideon Cross was a sensation in Charlotte, a story of shocking, intimate betrayal that captivated the city. He was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The final scene of the story belongs to Serena and Leo. It is a quiet Saturday morning, months after the trial. They are in the backyard of their home. Serena is watching Leo, who is sitting in the grass with a large sketch pad and a new set of colored pencils, the ones Gideon had given him. For the first time in 2 years, he is not drawing the broken sun. He is meticulously, carefully, drawing a house. It is a beautiful, modern house, with large windows and a strong, solid roof. It is the house his father had designed for them, the house they had all been so happy in. And in the sky above the house, he is drawing a sun. It is a brilliant, yellow, and perfectly whole circle, its rays spreading out to touch every corner of the page. He finishes the drawing, holds it up for Serena to see, and for the first time since that terrible night, he speaks of it. "It's our house," he says, his small voice clear and steady. "And that's Daddy's son." Serena looks at the drawing, at the whole sun, at the safe, strong house, and she feels the great heavy weight she has been carrying for 2 years begin to lift. The monsters were real, but they were gone. The silence had been broken, and in the quiet, sun-drenched backyard, a small, brave boy was finally beginning to draw his own future.